So far, I have argued for the importance of interpersonal communication by talking about the functions of interpersonal communication. And I've argued that at least the few functions that I mentioned before are important to our everyday lives, but even more so for our purposes to the healthcare setting, right? To the provision of healthcare to patients. To understand the importance of those functions even further, it's worth considering the consequences of those functions. In other words, the consequences of doing things like sharing information. Sharing information can have incredibly good consequences, particularly when there's so much information that you need to help a patient or perform some other task, far more information that only one person can have, right? In situations like that, sharing information is not just important on some kind of abstract level, but it's important because it has an important positive consequence. Of course, sharing information can also have very negative effects. It's entirely possible when interacting with other people that incorrect information gets exchanged, or incorrect information gets weighed more heavily than correct information because of perhaps who was saying it, right? If someone has higher status in society and they give a piece of information which is either irrelevant or maybe even wrong, unfortunately that piece of information is going to have a great deal of sway or power over the interactants and could have a very, very disastrous negative consequence. So we need to think not just in terms of functions, but in terms of the consequences of the serving of those functions to understand the importance of interpersonal communication. The same thing with social influence. We can, on the one hand, socially influencing someone through interpersonal communication can have very, very positive results. If we're a very persuasive healthcare provider, we might be able to get a patient to do something that they might not otherwise do, right? To adhere to a regimen of treatment that they might not have otherwise on their own, and that can be a very positive thing. But there can be negative consequences to social influence as well in the healthcare setting. So, for instance, sometimes patients are persuaded by their relatives to reject the expert opinion of a doctor or a pharmacist or a dental hygienist or whatever area of healthcare you might be in. And that social influence of the family member might be greatly to the detriment of the patient without them realizing that. So when we're talking about the importance of interpersonal communication and talking about its important consequences, we have to underscore the importance of those functions by noting both the very positive and the very negative consequences that they can have. Before we go any further, there is one last function that I didn't mention earlier, and that's the function of managing emotions. When we interact with people, we sometimes do so because we want to feel better, feel angrier, to change our emotions in some particular way. So let me give you an example. From time to time I've experienced sorrow over some event that's happened in my life. And I've not liked feeling sorrowful. I've not liked feeling depressed about some particular event. And so in order to get over that experience, or at least to get over the depths of sorrow over some particular loss or failure or what have you, I've called a sister, or my father, my mother, my wife. Right? I've called people in order to make myself feel better because I knew that in talking with one of those persons, they were going to make me feel better. They were going to remind me of better times. They were going to encourage me to look on the positive side of things, to believe that things might seem bad now, but they would be better in the future, right? All those things happen when we interact with other people, and so that's why we call other people, to make ourselves feel better when we feel down. And that's not the only way that we manage moods in interacting with other people. There are times, for instance, when we talk to people to get angrier. If you listen to talk radio, either the far right or the far left of the political spectrum, and you listen to callers calling in to the hosts, it's very clear that the caller is not only angry about the opposition, but is calling to voice that anger and have it magnified by the host of the radio station. So, in other words, those people are calling in to make their anger grow greater and greater through their interaction with the host. I want to take the topic of the consequences of interpersonal communication and push it even further, and in doing so, emphasize even further or support even more this claim that interpersonal communication is important. One of the first consequences that I want to talk about in this regard, one of these more, I think, more fundamental or fundamentally important consequences of interpersonal communication is that interpersonal communication creates our definition of or our sense of ourself. Now, there are a lot of people who say in our society that in order to know who you are, you have to look inside of you. And we're going to be talking about that view of the self later on in the semester. It's certainly a very strong view. It's a culturally important view. It's a view that we express to one another through our everyday interaction. What I want to suggest is that that view is not completely accurate. In fact, it's not accurate at all. What I want to suggest is that that we don't find out who we are by looking inside of ourselves through what sociologists, or rather I should say psychologists, call introspection. Right? Intro, looking inside, right? Looking, specchio, right? Latin for spectacles and whatnot, for looking inside oneself, right? That's what our culture mainly, I should say, the Western culture mainly proposes as a way to know who you are. But in fact, what I want to argue, and what most sociologists and social psychologists want to argue, is that in fact we learn who we are not through looking inside of ourselves, but through our interactions with other people. Their argument is that our self, who we are, is a social self. We are who we are because of who we have interacted with. Because we've interacted with our parents and our siblings and specific teachers that we've had in the past who changed our lives, made us see things, the world in different ways and whatnot. Right? So our self then is an accumulation or an agglomeration of experiences with other people. And it's also a conglomeration of experiences in certain settings. Right? There are people who can't afford to go to college, and that inability to go to college influences who they are, who they see themselves as. Just as your ability to go to college informs who you think you are, how you understand who you are. So, our definition of ourselves, our sense of who we are, right, who I am, is based on my social interaction with other people in specific social situations. That's why interpersonal communication is so important, because who we do it with and where we do it and how we do it really defines who we are as a person. Another important consequence of interpersonal communication, of this kind of more fundamental sense of consequence, is that it creates the definition of relationships. Later on in class, much later in the semester, I will argue, and we'll briefly argue here, that the relationships we have with other people are built entirely out of our interactions with those people, with things that we do. One of the reasons why interpersonal communication is so important is because it creates a definition of our relationships with other people. In other words, it kind of creates the nature of our interactions with our relationships with other people. To give you a kind of a foretaste of what we're going to be talking about later on, relationships can sometimes seem to be continuous through time, that they don't change, that once we've established a relationship, that relationship exists kind of on its own, even when we're apart from the other person. We have this feeling that there's this thing called a relationship that exists on its own, and that will continue to exist until we have some falling out with one another, right? If I get upset with the person I have a relationship, we'll end it at that point. And that absences in between different times that we interact are inconsequential. What I want to argue is, and what a fellow named Stuart Sigmund argues, and Sigmund is someone we're going to read later on, what Sigmund argues is that at least with regard to enduring relationships, relationships that we feel have a kind of some length to them, some duration to them, that our experience of that duration is created through the ways we interact with other people. In other words, it gets created, that sense of a relationship, a continuous relationship, gets created by the things that we do, by the specific things we do when we're interacting with other people interpersonally. So, for instance, one of the things he says is that it is not at all the case that we can assume that when we get back together with someone after some absence, that that person is going to interact with us in the same way. When we've been apart, that person may have had experiences that made them look at life in a totally different way and look at you and their relationship with you in a completely different way. I remember when I first started teaching, one of my students told me that she had gone back home. She was from an inner city area. She had gone back home from her semester at the university, her first semester at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that all of her friends said that she had changed, right? She said that all of them said, "You've changed, you've changed." And she said not only did they say that she had changed, but that they thought that she was kind of, had too high an opinion of herself now, and that that they couldn't relate to her. In other words, they kind of, in effect, tried to dissolve their relationships with her because of this absence. So absences from other people can very easily destroy a relationship. Sigmund says the way we prevent absences from destroying a relationship is by doing things like, when we're parting from someone that we want that we have a relationship with and we want that relationship to continue, we may part by saying things like, I'll see you tomorrow, right? Or I'll see you after you get home from your vacation. Those are statements which indicate to that other person, I think we have an enduring relationship. I think it will endure through this absence. And I see this absence only as a very kind of specific kind of absence with a beginning and an end, a clearly delineated end after which we will be back together again and we'll pick up where we left off. Sigmund says we also kind of create this sensation of an enduring relationship on the other end when we see someone that's been absent from us for a while by saying things like, hey, how was your vacation? In other words, we're indicating to the other person, I know you. I know you well enough to know you were going on a vacation. In fact, I said, hey, have a fun vacation. So now when you're coming back to me, I'm reestablishing our relationship as the same one that was going on before you went off to your vacation, what have you. Okay? So, interpersonal communication also creates a definition of relationships. It also creates a definition of society. Most of us, when we talk about society as though it's this thing, this monolithic presence that we're a little part of, and that society, in a sense, has a mind of its own, can force people to do things. We very often talk about how society has forced us to do things. Right? Very often times when people get in trouble and have to go to court, they might say to the judge or the jury, society did it. It wasn't me. It was my social upbringing. That's what's at fault for why I did what I did. Right? So this notion of society, of this being that can force us to do things, that's all created in our heads and in our interactions with other people. It doesn't really exist on its own. There is no actual hand that's putting itself on us and making us do what it wants us to do. Right? We create that sense of society in our interactions with each other. Well, we can go further, but I think perhaps those are the most important fundamental consequences that we can consider right now.